IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. A few weeks ago, the ICMR stoked a massive controversy by basically sending out a letter to a number of highly regarded medical institutions, not so subtly demanding clinical trials and a successful vaccine for COVID-19 by August 15th. This, of course, brings up a lot of issues. The first, of course, is how exactly one can have clinical trials within a particular amount of time. Does it make any scientific sense at all to commit to a politically feasible deadline to deliver a vaccine? And also brings up questions about, in a more kind of long-term sense, once the world eventually has a vaccine, once India eventually has a vaccine, how exactly is it going to be administered? What kind of issues might that bring up in terms of equity and access to the vaccine? To discuss these issues with me today, I have Shambhavi Naik and Sunila Dixit. Hi, guys.
Hi.
Hello.
So let's get started. Shambhavi, can you just quickly take us over the initial controversy? What exactly did the ICMR demand? And what does it tell us about broadly the state of science in India today?
Right. I think if I answer your second question first, what does it tell us about the state of science? I think we're in a very confused state. With the government, I think is still trying to figure out what role it should be playing and what role it should just be facilitating when it comes to vaccine development and deployment within India, right? So this letter, for example, that the ICMR sent out is a classic example of the government trying to overreach what it should be doing. So this is a vaccine that has been developed by Bharat Biotech, a company based out of Hyderabad. It's known as the Covaxin. And the ICMR has basically partnered with Bharat Biotech to expedite clinical trials for this particular vaccine. Which kind of makes sense because we want to expedite a vaccine for COVID-19, and we all want to go back to a normal life as soon as possible. And at this point of time, a vaccine really seems to be the only kind of scientific medicine that we can get to actually return to normalcy of any sorts. Whether ICMR had to partner with them is a secondary question, and I think we can come to that later. But what ICMR has done is sent out a letter to 12 hospitals and mandating them to start recruiting trial participants for testing this particular vaccine. They sent it out on 2nd of July and said that patients should start enrolling by 7th of July. So not patients, volunteers should start enrolling by 7th of July. And that it was envisaged that the vaccine be launched for public health use latest by 15th August 2020. Obviously, the date 15th August has connotations to it of this being a political statement that India will have a vaccine and there will be a speech, and in the speech you will say that, hey, we have a vaccine that will be out. India will be self-sufficient, etc., in curing our own population. Right?
Oh, I'm sure it'll make for a great kind of trending hashtag on Times Now and on Twitter.
I mean, it feeds into the whole Atmanirbhar thing as well. But I mean, politics aside from it, it would be great if India has its own vaccine, scientifically speaking. Two reasons. One, that what we have seen is that the strain of the coronavirus is different in different countries. We saw this problem with diagnostic kits as well. So if you imported diagnostic kits from another country which were developed for the strain there, sometimes we saw errors in picking up the virus that was present in India, right? So it is best that an Indian strain of the virus is chosen to create a vaccine against. It's likely to be more effective than if we picked another strain.
I'm also assuming it makes sense from a strategic perspective because there's a real risk of like us not being able to afford like a global market because we'd be like priced out of it, right?
Yeah. So the second point was that it has to be reasonably priced for us. And so if it is an Indian-made vaccine, obviously we are the biggest manufacturer. So manufacturing in that sense, we have a stronghold of anyway. So it makes more sense for us to have the technology as well as the manufacturing prowess for a vaccine, right? So it is great that India is trying to create vaccines. This is not obviously our first either. Zadis Karila has also been working on a different vaccine. I think there's 6 or 7 possible candidates within India for a COVID-19 vaccine. But this particular one seems to be very promising. What we hear of is that the animal studies have been promising, but again, no data has been released either by ICMR or by Bharat Biotech. So we have no data to go on, only opinions of people that this is a very promising candidate, right? And so based on that, what they said was that, hey, let's go and start clinical trials. Now, clinical trials is obviously a pretty long process, mainly looking at two things. One, that a vaccine is safe for use. And we have known this before because some sorts of vaccines are either attenuated live vaccines or because they are protein subunits that can cause immune reactions. In some contexts, they can cause adverse reactions. So they will start an immune response in a person, but the immune response doesn't stop. And that causes issues. So the first thing that a clinical trial basically sets out to do is make sure that the vaccine is safe. And second, that it can effectively generate an immune response against the disease that we are targeting.
And I'm assuming that needs to apply like across the population, right? So not just for like 20-year-olds who don't have a smoking habit.
Yeah. So in the first phase, we will particularly look at healthy volunteers and make sure that there is no base level of adverse reactions happening. And then in the second phases, you start actually getting in more vulnerable populations or your target group. So for example, a lot of the vaccines that target infants, you won't in the phase 1 look at infants. You'll probably start with a slightly elder target population, slightly elder population, and then move to your target population.
So I'm assuming that like narrowing down and making sure that a vaccine would work for all segments of the population would actually be a very time-consuming process, right? Which makes it all the stranger that the ICMR adopted such a kind of tone with the medical institutions, basically saying that if you don't comply, if you don't start the clinical trials, if you don't get the approvals, and if it's not done by August 15, there are going to be consequences.
Can I add more to that controversy?
Sure.
The enrollment of subjects is not really easy for clinical trials. So you need to take informed consent from the subjects, right? So it is not necessary that everyone will agree to participate in clinical trials. So that is the first issue.
Yeah.
Secondly, according to the details from the Clinical Trials Registry of India, Bharat Biotech said in its application that estimated time frame required for phase 1 and phase 2 trials will take at least a year and 3 months, which is nowhere near the time frame of 1 month given by ICMR. So that is another issue. Even the vaccines that are in the advanced stages, like in phase 3, even they have a longer time frame to actually get in the market. So it seems a little impossible for Covaxin to be out by 15th August.
So even before the clinical trial participant enrollment, all the sites need to have ethical approval. And obviously, ethics committee has to make sure that everything that a phase 1 clinical trial requires is present. So it is not just that you need a room where a volunteer can come and sit and get injected with a vaccine. Because we're trying to rule out adverse events, all the necessary equipment that is required to resuscitate any volunteer with an adverse reaction has to be present on the site, right? So you need pretty specialized medical equipment. You need trained doctors, etc., etc. So the consent form also has to be approved by the ethics committee of that particular institution. And so what the ICMR letter actually asked for was that all of these ethics approvals be also be done as soon as possible, which will have to be done before the enrollment by itself, so in like 4 days. And that I find is the most unethical thing to ask of an ethical committee to do, because what the letter implied was that if you did not get the approval, there would be some sort of punishment, and it implied that non-compliance will be dealt with. So it was basically like saying that, hey, the ethics committee has to approve you whether you have the stuff or not. And if you don't have the stuff, then you either get the ethics committee to give you an incorrect approval, or you get your things organized in 4 days. Which if I was a clinical trial participant, I would really not like to go to a hospital like that. But and what we subsequently also other investigators found was that 4 of the 12 sites that were named in that letter had only just registered their ethics committee, and 2 of them were less than a year old. So clearly the ethics committee themselves were also a little problematic in this particular episode.
Does it seem like the ICMR chose these institutions because the ethics committees were new and might have been more open to doing this sort of thing?
So we don't really know from where these 12 hospitals came, because if you see the list as well, not a lot of them are like big metropolitan hospitals. Some of them are even nursing homes.
Nursing homes.
Yeah, we don't know where this list has actually come from.
And now the ICMR, if I understand correctly, has kind of quote unquote clarified its stance, saying that these were just suggestions and there will not actually be any consequences. So what actually is the situation in terms of clinical trials for a vaccine in India at this point?
So, like Sunila mentioned, that the clinical trial process obviously is pretty long, and it has to be pretty long. And we have to understand that in the case of COVID-19, because an expedited vaccine is necessary, some of the steps might be cut down. Like, you don't essentially want to take shortcuts in the way the science is worked out, but some things might, the trade-off is much higher than in terms of other vaccines, and so it makes sense that we try to expedite certain phases of the trials. But I don't think we have any clarity on what that should be. The WHO has, I think, released a list of guidelines on how expedited trials should look like. But definitely, even with that, 15th August is not a feasible deadline at all. I think what irked me more about that letter was the fact that it said that we envisage that this will be launched. So not only were they saying that the trials would be done, but they were saying that the trials would be successful.
Yeah.
And no scientist can ever have that outlook to an experiment.
Absolutely.
Right? No one can ever go into an experiment saying that, hey, I know this is going to be the result of my experiment. I mean,
That's a big assumption to make.
Yeah, you can't have that bias at all.
I don't think it's an assumption. I mean, at the risk of sound like a cynic, which is usually the stance I adopt in all things policy, it seems like the government basically sat on the ICMR's head and said, look, boss, I don't care what you do. You get us a vaccine by August 15th so we can say that we're independent from corona. And the ICMR went and found a bunch of medical institutions that thought it could arm twist into accepting a vaccine that, again, has no data backing it, but is spoken well of in government circles. It seems the whole entire thing smacks of ignorance of science and a carefully managed media operation, as opposed to like the actual like grunt work of finding a solution to the problem, which is something that we are seeing this government do, not just in terms of the COVID management, but also in terms of what's happening on our border with China. But let's be optimistic. Let's assume that very soon in May 2021, as the Ministry of Science and Technology has said, let's say in early 2021, we do have a vaccine ready. That still doesn't exactly solve the problem, right? Because bringing a vaccine to this point where it's ready to market is one thing. But once it's actually ready to market, how are you actually going to get it to the population, Doc? So, I mean, what percentage of India's population needs to be inoculated against COVID for some semblance of normal economic activity to return?
Even if we say that about 60% of India's population needs to be vaccinated, and there are a lot of assumptions that go into this. A is that the vaccine is effective in everybody. B, that we need only one shot of the vaccine, which at this point of time looks unlikely. So a lot of studies out there are now pointing that people who had COVID-19 once are getting it again, which means that the immune reaction to COVID-19 is not holding on for a sufficiently long time, which very much like the flu, you might have to take a vaccine every season. So we're still trying to figure out the science behind that. But let's assume for now that, hey, we're going to need to give 60% of India's population a vaccine shot once. That's still 780 million people.
Wow. And that's a best case scenario.
Yeah.
That's a best case scenario. Our current biggest program, which is the Universal Immunization Program, I think caters to about 60 million people. That's infants and mothers.
And I'm assuming like it's easier to vaccinate infants and mothers because these are infants and mothers who are vaccinated soon after birth.
Well, the mothers start with the tetanus shot when they're carrying the child, and then the children up to the age of 5, I think, get vaccinations, the polio, BCG, etc., all of those. So 12 of them, the rotavirus.
I'm assuming that it's easy enough to find volunteers to do this sort of thing, right? You take the name off the list and you're done. But to vaccinate 780 million people, including an awful lot of adults, in an enormous variety of like urban centers, rural centers, diverse geographic areas, And especially given given the nature of COVID and how contagious it is, there's also a very high risk that volunteers might get the vaccine and also end up kind of spreading the disease unless they're also quarantined systematically. So, I mean, the sheer size of the volunteer workforce required to do this, the amount of resources required to put into this is honestly nothing like India has ever done. This would definitely be one of the greatest achievements we've ever pulled off, if we pull it off, which I'm not too sure about right now. What are your guys' thoughts?
You're right, Anirudh. I mean, the sheer scale of the spread of the disease and the operations that we will require in terms of logistics of taking the vaccine to various parts of the country, and we having trained people to give the vaccine, something unprecedented. But again, I think it's something we can prepare for, assuming that we have at least 8 to 10 months before the vaccine is available. I think the best use of the time now is to figure out a priority list of people that we need to give the vaccine to. So like you said, the health volunteers should be probably the first people to get the vaccine themselves, so that they are comfortable in going out and giving the vaccine to others and not contracting the disease while doing so, right? The other thing is really, what do we want to target? Whom do we want to target? Is it that we want the economy to be up and running first, and therefore let's try and give the vaccine to people who need to travel, get out of the house to go to work? Or do we want to target mortality and bring down mortality rates, and therefore should we be targeting those over 60 who are more vulnerable to the disease? There are a lot of scientific questions yet that remain about the disease and how it spreads. And I think we should really take the next 6 months to kind of figure out what it is that we want to achieve with the vaccine, and therefore whom it should be targeted to. If we want to target, like I said, if we want to target the spread of the disease itself, we are still trying to figure out how the disease spreads. I mean, is it aerosols? Do asymptomatic people spread it or not? There are so many questions that we continue to debate on when it comes to this COVID-19. And if we do not have a coherent and evidence-based approach to giving the vaccine, it is going to be hugely problematic. Because, I mean, one thing is pretty certain. Even inoculating 780 million people is going to take some time. It cannot be done overnight, right? And therefore, how do we best want to spend those few months is a question we need to answer in the time leading up to that.
Right. Assuming that we have like a time frame that is not limited till 15th August, I think, as Shambhavi said, we should focus more on the vaccine supply and like how we are going to administer the vaccine to the people who need it actually. And one thing we need to consider is who will actually administer the vaccine, because as per the universal immunization program, most of the burden falls on the frontline workers for people to become aware about the vaccine and to get people to vaccinate themselves, right? So we need to think about what burden it will put on the frontline workers. And then we need to figure out if we have enough of them and if we need to mobilize volunteers for the vaccination drive. Also, another thing to be noted is that we need to figure out how many people need to be vaccinated to develop herd immunity, and if herd immunity even exists in first place for COVID-19 actually, because COVID-19 is highly contagious, right? So there is no evidence as such to herd immunity, if herd immunity exists or not. So even that we need to consider.
Okay, thanks guys. That makes a lot of sense. I think broadly our takeaways are that let's not compromise on the science and the safety measures that are required in order to get a good workable vaccine out there. Let's really think seriously about, once the vaccine is ready, who in India needs to get it. Make sure that the way that we deploy it is safe and manages to get to a large enough section of the population. And most importantly, we must not give in to political pressure to get a vaccine out by a particular date, right? We just cannot skimp, once again, to emphasize, we cannot skimp on the science. That said, we've recently heard, in fact, that I think Moderna now has a vaccine that has induced an immune response in everybody that was administered to in a clinical trial. So clearly the world is making progress, and it's possible to do that in a rapid but also scientifically feasible way. But there's also another vaccine somewhere in the world that we haven't yet talked about, and that is in the original epicenter of the outbreak itself in China. So what's the situation there, Doc?
So China has got a vaccine that they say has undergone clinical trials and has been currently, they've prioritized their armed forces to get the vaccine. We don't really have a lot of information on why or how effective this vaccine is, but they have already started giving it out to the armed forces. Globally, along with Moderna, I think the Oxford University vaccine also seems to be doing pretty well. So I think we are getting close to having a vaccine. We just have to now try and figure out how effective that vaccine is going to be in the real world, and how many doses we'll need to give. And I think the key takeaway from this entire ICMR vaccine episode is that in a follow-up after all the backlash that the ICMR received, they sent out another letter that said that, hey, this is an unprecedented situation, and therefore we are just trying to expedite trials and cut through the red tape. We have to now take the next 6 months to figure out if there is any such red tape within the deployment of the vaccine scene as well, and cut that out as soon as possible, and try not to go the China way of forcing a certain section of the population to get a vaccine, but have a more scientific and cogent approach in picking that population as well. And maybe at the end of this entire episode, we can sit down and think about why this red tape even exists, if the ICMR believes that it can be cut through in a scientifically safe manner. So more questions than answers, but I think there are lessons that we can learn from here.
I think it is important to remember that one can fast track the regulatory processes like cutting the red tape and all, but you cannot actually fast track the immune response of the people, right? So it makes no sense to put a deadline to launch a vaccine.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much, guys. I just spent the last minute or so listening to you and also listening to the sweet sound of an ambulance siren in the background. I hope that whoever the ambulance is heading for stays safe and recovers from the virus. And I hope that all of you listening to All Things Policy are staying safe through this series of lockdowns and unlockdowns, and that your families are doing well as well. On that note, thank you guys so much for joining me, and thank you for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST, or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money and Intel. It's been a really, really cool week on the network. We've had Ashwin Sanghi on Cyrus Says. We have Masaba Gupta on Advertising is Dead. You should definitely check out Vivek Lath, who showed up on Storytellers and Story Sellers. A close friend and partner of ours, Karthik Paricha, was on the Pragati podcast talking about the future of podcasting, which I think is really, really interesting. And I would like to ask people to check out All Things Policy and what they've been doing. They've been having some really interesting discussions about India's challenging relationship with China as we go forward, and I think that would be a great thing for you guys to check out. So with that, we hope to see you again next week.
Entertainment is like food for the brain. It's a window to culture and a great way to understand the world around us. The internet has changed what it means to be an entertainer, creating new storytellers with millions of fans. It has spawned a new breed, the story-sellers, those behind the scenes creating the business for this ecosystem. They work with brands, platforms and channels who are keen to capitalize on an audience hungrier than ever for more stories. I'm Vineet Kanabar, and I have a ringside view to how stories are told and sold. On my show, I bring you creators, artists, executives and marketers for a freewheeling conversation around the business of entertainment. Tune in to Storytellers and Story Sellers for personal stories, analysis and criticism every Thursdays as I talk to the brightest minds telling or selling great stories today.